Plainfield, Wisconsin, 1957, a tiny farming town where life moved slow and winters seemed to last forever. The people were simple, church-going, and private, the kind who waved from their porches and minded their own business. It was the kind of town that never made headlines, a place where gossip traveled faster than the mail, and everyone thought they knew everyone. And then there was Ed Gein, the quiet handyman who lived out on the old Gein farm, miles from the nearest neighbor. He was a small, polite man with a shy grin, the kind of person who seemed harmless. People said he was strange, but in a sad, pitiful way. He fixed tractors, mended fences, helped with odd jobs, and even babysat for families who trusted him. He wasn't much for conversation, but he was dependable, always on time, always polite. The Gein farm, though, was something else. It stood like a ghost on the edge of town, 160 acres of barren land and broken dreams. The house was old, falling apart, filled with the smell of dust and damp wood. After his mother died years earlier, Ed lived there alone, shutting himself off from the world. The once warm and bustling farmhouse became a tomb. He boarded up her room and never allowed a soul inside again. People whispered about him sometimes. They said he was lonely, that maybe the isolation had gotten to him. He'd show up at the local tavern once in a while, buying a beer and sitting in silence while others laughed and told hunting stories. Some said he read strange books about death, anatomy, and the occult. Others said he went to the graveyard late at night, though no one ever believed it. On the morning of November 16, 1957, the quiet of Plainfield cracked open. Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old widow who ran the town's hardware store, went missing. Her son, Frank Worden, was the local deputy sheriff. He stopped by the store that afternoon, expecting to see her behind the counter like always. Instead, the place was empty. The cash register drawer hung open, a pool of blood stained the floor, and the trail led out the back door into the snow. On the counter lay the last sales receipt she had written that morning. It was for a gallon of antifreeze, sold to Ed Gein. Frank didn't need to think twice. By sundown, a convoy of squad cars and deputies were bouncing down the frozen dirt road toward the Gein farm. The house looked dead, its windows black against the falling snow. There was no sound, no light. When they pried the door open, the smell hit first, a thick, choking stench of decay and rot that made even hardened men cover their faces. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on something hanging in the shed. At first it looked like a deer carcass. Then someone screamed. It was Bernice Worden, hung upside down, gutted, her head and organs removed. She had been butchered like game. Inside the house it only got worse. The kitchen was chaos, piles of junk, broken dishes, and newspaper clippings everywhere. The deputies moved slowly, their lights trembling as they swept across the room. And then they began to see things that made them wish they hadn't. A chair covered in human skin, bowls made from skulls, a belt strung with human nipples, a box filled with noses, masks, real faces tacked to the walls like trophies. Everywhere they looked there were pieces of people, lampshades made from flesh, hearts preserved in jars. The house wasn't a home, it was a museum of the macabre. In one corner they found a grotesque woman's suit, sewn from the skins of several corpses, complete with breasts and a mask. Later, investigators learned Ed would put it on and walk around the house pretending to be his mother. Outside, the snow kept falling as officers searched every room. One deputy vomited in the kitchen sink. Another stumbled out into the yard, shaking and crying. Even the sheriff, hardened by years on the job, was left pale and speechless. No one had ever seen anything like it, not in Wisconsin, not anywhere. They found Bernice's head in a burlap sack, a nail driven through each ear so it could be hung on a wall. In a bag nearby was the face of another woman, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had gone missing 3 years earlier. Her disappearance had baffled police for years. Now, in the nightmare of that farmhouse, her face had been found. Ed Gein was arrested later that night at a neighbor's house. He didn't fight. He didn't run. When the sheriff's car pulled up, he just smiled and said, "I know why you're here." Under questioning, his voice was calm, even gentle. He spoke like a man confessing to something minor, not the unspeakable horror they had just uncovered. He told detectives about sneaking into local cemeteries at night, about digging up freshly buried bodies, mostly women who reminded him of his mother, Augusta Jane. He said he brought them home, took what he needed, and experimented. Sometimes, he admitted, he would sit beside the graves of women he admired, talking to them as though they could hear him. Other times, he'd dig them up, cut off what he wanted, and leave the rest behind. He claimed he only killed 2 women, Bernice and Mary, but police knew he had desecrated countless graves. When asked why, his answer was chillingly simple: "I wanted to be her, my mother." For years, Ed Gein had lived alone with her voice echoing in his head. She had been a strict, religious woman who preached about sin and women being instruments of the devil. She taught him that lust was evil, that all women were corrupt, all except her. When she died in 1945, something inside him snapped. Her death left a void so deep that he tried to bring her back, piece by piece, from the bodies of other women. The Jane farm was sealed off, guarded by state police. Reporters flooded into Plainfield, turning the quiet town into a circus. The farmhouse, once a lonely speck in the snow, became the most infamous address in America. People couldn't believe that the quiet, polite man they'd known, the one who fixed their kids' toys and shoveled their driveways, had been living in a house full of human remains. Neighbors who once trusted him now spoke in whispers. He was just odd, one said. Never thought he'd hurt anyone. Others recalled strange moments that suddenly made sense: the missing tools, the late-night trips, the odd smell from his old truck. Ed's name spread across the country within days. Headlines screamed about the Ghoul of Plainfield, the mad butcher, the real-life monster. His story fascinated and horrified the nation, and for good reason. It wasn't just murder. It was desecration, obsession, madness unlike anything people had ever imagined. When police cataloged the evidence, they counted over a dozen body parts from at least 15 different women. Some items couldn't even be identified anymore. Each piece told the story of a mind completely untethered from reality. A man who blurred the line between the living and the dead, between love and possession. The farmhouse was eventually destroyed by fire. Some say it was arson, others say it was mercy. But even burned to ashes, it left a stain on American history that would never fade. Ed Gein's crimes marked the end of small-town innocence. And though he sat quietly in a cell, the images from that house, the faces, the skin, the silence would live on, infecting the nightmares of generations to come. Before the horrors of that farmhouse, before the lampshades and masks and the name Ghoul of Plainfield became a legend, there was just a small boy named Ed. He was born in 1906, the second son of George and Augusta Jane. They lived a quiet, isolated life on a modest farm in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. George was a drunk, a failed tanner and carpenter who drifted from job to job, his anger burning hotter with every bottle he emptied. But Augusta was something else entirely. To Ed, she was everything: God, judge, protector, and jailer. She ruled the home with an iron hand and a Bible. She despised her husband, calling him worthless and weak, and she despised the world beyond her front door even more. In her eyes, the world was wicked, filled with sinners, especially women. She taught her sons that women were instruments of Satan, corrupting men through desire. Only she, Augusta Jane, was pure. Each day she gathered her boys and read scripture aloud, her voice rising with fury as she preached about damnation and punishment. She spoke of Sodom, of the harlots, of the wrath of God. The boys weren't allowed to bring friends home, weren't allowed to visit other children, weren't even allowed to speak freely. Outside their mother's gaze, they were strangers to the world. Inside her home, they were captives. Ed adored her. Every word she said sank deep into him. When he tried to laugh, she scolded him for being foolish. When he showed curiosity about girls, she shamed him, warning that all women except her were evil. That kind of control doesn't just wound a child, it rewires him. Ed grew quiet, inward, unable to see life beyond her approval. His older brother, Henry, was different. Henry saw through their mother's fanaticism and tried to break free. He found work, made friends, and even began dating. Ed didn't understand it. To him, loyalty to their mother was sacred. Henry once told a friend that he worried about Ed, said the boy was too attached to Augusta, that something about his devotion felt wrong. In 1944, during a controlled brush fire on their property, Henry was found dead under strange circumstances. He had been burned, but not enough to kill him. There were bruises on his head, suspicious ones. The police ruled it an accident, but even then people whispered. Some believed Ed had lured him into the fire. Ed himself showed no grief. He told neighbors it was God's will. Now, with Henry gone, Augusta had no one left but her favorite son. She suffered a stroke that same year. Ed cared for her day and night, cooking her meals, cleaning her body, reading her the Bible. When she recovered enough to speak, she became crueler than ever. Her hatred for the world seemed to deepen, and Ed absorbed every poisonous word. Then in 1945 she had another stroke, this one fatal. When she died, Ed's world collapsed. He wept beside her body for hours, then days. He sealed off her bedroom, nailed the door shut, and left everything exactly as it was, her bed, her clothes, her Bible, untouched. The rest of the house fell into ruin, but that room remained a shrine. To him, she wasn't gone. She was simply waiting for him to bring her back. After her death, something inside Ed broke quietly, like a candle snuffed out. He lived alone, taking small jobs to keep himself afloat. The farmhouse grew darker, filled with filth and decay. Rats scurried through the kitchen, and garbage piled up until it formed small mountains. He'd sit for hours listening to the radio, reading pulp magazines about war, anatomy, and crime. He collected books about Nazis, headhunters, cannibal tribes, anything that blurred the line between death and ritual. People in Plainfield still saw him around town. He'd stop by the hardware store or the tavern, sometimes giggling nervously, sometimes muttering to himself. He'd talk about strange things, about bodies, about taxidermy, about how recently buried graves were loose enough to dig. Most thought he was just lonely or odd. Some kids even teased him, calling him Weird Ed. But there were others who felt uneasy around him, the kind of instinct you can't explain, only feel in your gut. When Mary Hogan vanished in 1954, people joked that Ed probably took her home. He'd even laughed about it himself, saying things like, "She's not missing, she's at my place." Nobody took him seriously. In a small town, dark humor passes for harmless talk. But 3 years later, when Bernice Worden disappeared, no one was laughing anymore. During his interrogation, Ed's confession spilled out in the same flat, emotionless tone he used when buying groceries. He told detectives that he had visited 3 cemeteries near Plainfield at night, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. He'd dig up the graves of women who resembled his mother, often within days of their burial. He said he didn't always take the bodies. Sometimes he'd just sit there, talking to them, feeling close to her again. But sometimes, he admitted, he couldn't resist. He'd take what he called souvenirs, skin, bones, organs. He'd use them to create things, lampshades, masks, furniture. He said he was trying to make a woman's suit, so he could put it on, walk around the house, and feel like his mother again. When asked why he killed Bernice and Mary, his answer was simple: "I needed fresh material." To the officers listening, it didn't sound like madness. It sounded like a man calmly describing a craft. The horror of it wasn't in his rage, it was in his calm. He wasn't a wild killer. He was methodical, patient, and proud of his work. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with schizophrenia and grave robbery fetishism, but even they struggled to define the depths of his mind. He wasn't driven by lust or money or even hatred. He was driven by grief, grief so twisted it became worship. His crimes weren't random acts of cruelty. They were acts of devotion to a dead woman who had ruled his every thought. In one chilling confession, Ed said that after exhuming a corpse, he'd take it home, speak to it, and pretend it was still alive. He said he made masks of their faces so he could see them again. He talked about how he'd dance in the moonlight wearing the skin suit, feeling close to her. One detective asked who he meant by her. He looked up with a soft smile and said, "Mother." The more investigators dug into his past, the clearer the picture became. Ed wasn't a monster in the classic sense. He wasn't angry or violent for pleasure. He was lost, a boy who never grew beyond his mother's shadow. But that made him even more terrifying. He was the embodiment of obsession, of what happens when love turns into madness. News of his crimes spread across America like wildfire. People couldn't stop reading about him. Reporters camped outside the jail, and tourists drove to Plainfield just to see the burned remains of his house. Some tried to buy pieces of it. One carnival owner even offered to purchase the farmhouse before it was destroyed, planning to display it as a traveling house of horrors. Hollywood took notice too. Writers and filmmakers began weaving his story into fiction. A few years later, Alfred Hitchcock would create Norman Bates, the polite, mother-obsessed motel owner in Psycho. Then came Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, swinging his saw while wearing the skin of others. Later still, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs would echo Jane's grotesque transformation rituals. Every one of them traced back to Plainfield, to that farmhouse frozen in the snow. What made Ed Gein unforgettable wasn't just what he did, it was what he represented. He shattered the illusion of safety. He proved that monsters could look like neighbors, that evil could live quietly at the end of a dirt road, smiling as it waves from the porch. He was a man so ordinary that no one ever looked twice. That ordinariness is what makes him terrifying. Even years after his arrest, people in Plainfield refused to talk about him. Parents told their children never to say his name. The land where his house once stood became overgrown, abandoned, haunted by memory. Locals said that on cold nights, you could still see a single light flicker where the farmhouse used to be, and hear the faint echo of a man's voice calling out for his mother. Ed Gein never left Plainfield, not really. He became part of its soil, part of its legend. And even as the world moved on, his shadow stretched across American culture, feeding the nightmares that followed. The courthouse in Washoe County overflowed with reporters, photographers, and onlookers who couldn't resist a glimpse of the monster from Plainfield. When Ed Gein shuffled into the courtroom for the first time, dressed in faded work clothes and looking confused rather than menacing, gasps filled the air. Many had expected a towering, blood-soaked killer. Instead, he looked like a frail farmer dragged from his barn, his eyes darting around the room like a lost child. That contrast, his harmless appearance versus the horror he created, only deepened the fascination. When asked if he understood the charges against him, Ed nodded weakly. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. His soft voice barely reached the front row. Prosecutors charged him with the murder of Bernice Worden and the desecration of multiple graves across Wisconsin. But as details emerged, it became clear this case wasn't just about murder. It was about madness. Psychiatrists examined him for weeks. What they found was a man living in a world completely detached from reality. He spoke about his mother, Augusta, as though she were still alive. He called her pure and holy, the only woman who ever deserved respect. Every other woman, he said, was corrupt, sinful, and deserving of punishment. His obsession with her had never faded. If anything, it had grown more powerful after her death. He admitted that after Augusta passed away in 1945, he began reading pulp magazines about Nazis, cannibals, and cult rituals. Those stories twisted with his religious guilt and loneliness until they became something new, a need to bring his mother back. He told doctors that he robbed graves only to retrieve parts that reminded him of her. Sometimes he would wear the woman's suit, pretending to be her, speaking to himself in her voice. When asked if he killed to get those parts, Ed shrugged. "I don't remember," he said. "I guess I might have." It was that eerie detachment that terrified even the most experienced investigators. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge. He wasn't trying to hide his crimes. He simply lived in a fantasy where death and life had blurred together. As the trial continued, journalists compared him to Frankenstein and Dracula. Headlines screamed "House of Horror," and Human Skin SOUVNIRS found ON Farm. Horror movie directors clipped those articles, unknowingly laying the foundation for future icons like Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. The world had never seen a killer quite like Ed Gein, a murderer whose crimes were so grotesque they transcended reality. But the court had to decide whether he was evil or insane. His lawyers argued the latter. The state psychiatrists agreed. After just 9 days, the judge ruled Ed Gein legally insane, unfit for trial, and committed him to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Plainfield finally exhaled, but the relief didn't last long. The town became synonymous with death. People moved away. The once busy Main Street grew quiet. Children whispered stories about the Gein farm, daring each other to sneak close at night. Local hunters refused to cross his land, even after the police burned most of what was left. For years, the property stood like a cursed monument, a silent reminder that the devil could wear the face of an ordinary man. Inside the hospital, Ed adapted to his new life almost peacefully. Nurses described him as polite, helpful, even gentle. He mopped floors, painted, and read books about anatomy and religion. When visitors came, he smiled shyly and asked about Plainfield as though it were still his home. Sometimes, he talked about his farm and said he missed his mother's room. One nurse later recalled walking past Ed's cell one night and hearing him softly humming hymns. It wasn't the sound of a madman, she said. It was the sound of a child who never grew up. In the following years, true crime writers and filmmakers flooded Wisconsin, chasing interviews with anyone who knew him. Some townspeople cashed in on the notoriety, selling souvenirs, postcards, even dirt from the Gein property. Others despised it, wanting the name erased forever. But by then, it was too late. Ed Gein had become an American legend of horror. When Psycho hit theaters in 1960, audiences screamed at Norman Bates' twisted devotion to his mother, not realizing how close it was to the truth. Alfred Hitchcock never used Ed's name, but everyone in Wisconsin knew. The same was true for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974 and Silence of the Lambs in 1991. Each film borrowed pieces of his legacy: the skin masks, the furniture, the eerie calmness after the killing. Every time a new horror classic emerged, Plainfield's nightmare lived on. For Ed, those years passed quietly behind hospital walls. He never showed remorse, never seemed to grasp what he had done. When asked by a doctor if he ever missed his victims, he looked puzzled and said, "They weren't really people to me, just parts." It was a chilling answer that summed up his warped mind, a man who saw the human body not as life, but as raw material for something else. By the late 1970s, his name had become a pop culture myth. True crime books labeled him the Butcher of Plainfield, while horror fans called him the Ghoul. Reporters revisited the story each Halloween, reprinting photos of the farmhouse and the grotesque evidence catalog. Yet through it all, Ed Gein himself remained strangely forgotten, a quiet, aging man in a hospital chair, staring out a barred window as if he could still see the fields of Plainfield stretching before him. When a journalist asked him in 1978 if he ever thought about freedom, Ed smiled faintly. "I'm happy here," he said. "It's peaceful." He didn't understand why people called him evil. To him, everything he did made sense in a world ruled by his mother's ghost. By the time his health began to fail in the early 1980s, Plainfield had long moved on. The farm had burned down, the land auctioned off. But nothing could erase the mark he left, not just on the town, but on American culture itself. Ed Gein wasn't the first killer in U.S. history, but he was the one who changed how America thought about evil. He showed that monsters didn't always lurk in cities or wear masks. Sometimes, they lived alone in the country, fixing fences, helping neighbors, and whispering prayers before turning out the light. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Ed Gein had spent more than 2 decades inside Central State Hospital. The world outside had changed completely. The country that once gasped in horror at his crimes was now making movies inspired by them. Teenagers lined up to watch masked killers on screen, never realizing that much of that darkness began with one lonely farmer in Wisconsin. Ed didn't know about the fame he had inspired. In his small, confined world, days blended together like the endless snow over Plainfield's fields. He painted, read the Bible, attended therapy, and occasionally made small crafts in occupational workshops. Nurses said he was polite, quiet, and almost childlike. When he smiled, it was a weak, innocent smile, as if he'd forgotten everything he'd done. But every so often, a shadow crossed his face, a flicker of the man who once hunted in graveyards by moonlight. He never asked for release. When doctors mentioned the idea, he shook his head. "I wouldn't belong out there," he said once. "It's not the same anymore." He was right. Plainfield wasn't the same, and neither was America. In the mid-1970s, a small-time developer bought what was left of the Gein farm at a county auction. People came from miles around to see it. Some wanted to witness the house of horrors. Others wanted a piece of history. Before the sale could happen, the unthinkable occurred. The farmhouse mysteriously caught fire. Flames devoured everything, leaving behind nothing but ash and blackened beams. Firefighters arrived too late to save it. By dawn, the house that had once held so much evil was gone, its remains smoldering like a burned-out nightmare. Locals said it was divine justice. Others whispered that someone from town had set it ablaze to end the shame once and for all. The official report listed the cause as unknown, but everyone knew nobody was sorry. The next morning, when Ed heard the news in the hospital, he barely reacted. "Just as well," he said quietly. "That place had too many memories." Even after the farm disappeared, people couldn't stay away from the story. Tourists visited Plainfield every Halloween, searching for the exact spot where the farmhouse once stood. They chipped away at the soil, filling jars with Gein dirt to sell online. Some even stole pieces of the cemetery gate near where his victims were buried. The town council tried to erase the legend, but every attempt only made it grow stronger. In 1984, Ed Gein's health began to fail. He developed cancer and was moved to the Mendota Mental Health Institute for specialized care. There, he lived quietly, occasionally talking about his mother as though she had just gone to church. When a nurse asked him if he ever thought about Bernice Worden or Mary Hogan, his two confirmed victims, he simply said, "They were nice ladies." Then he went back to reading his Bible. He died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. No family came to claim his body. He was buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery under a simple headstone marked Edward Gein 1906-1984. For a while, people left flowers there. Then, as the years passed, the grave became a dark tourist attraction. Visitors chipped pieces from the stone as souvenirs until it was finally stolen in 2000. Police later recovered it in Seattle, thousands of miles away. Today, it remains locked away in storage, too infamous to be displayed again. Even in death, Ed couldn't rest quietly. His story kept returning to headlines, documentaries, and film adaptations. Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Deranged, Silence of the Lambs, they all carried his fingerprints, reshaping his horror into pop culture. Each time his name resurfaced, the people of Plainfield cringed. They wanted to move on, but the world wouldn't let them. In interviews, a few surviving townspeople remembered him not as a monster but as that strange fellow who helped shovel snow. They couldn't reconcile that image with the truth. One elderly woman said, "He was always polite, always quiet. If you told me what he did back then, I'd have called you a liar." That contradiction, the gentle voice behind unspeakable cruelty, became the heart of his legend. Ed Gein wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He wasn't hunting for pleasure or trophies. He was building a world that made sense only to him, a twisted shrine to his dead mother, and a warped reflection of loneliness that stretched into madness. Experts still study his case today. Psychologists call it psychotic attachment, maternal fixation, or necrophilic compulsion, but no diagnosis fully explains what he became. He wasn't motivated by greed or hate or lust. His crimes were an attempt to rewrite death, to make his mother immortal through the skin of others. That's what makes him so terrifying. He believed what he did was right. Decades later, when filmmakers recreated his story, they often exaggerated him into something monstrous, a chainsaw-wielding beast, a deranged killer in a mask. The truth was subtler and more disturbing. The real Ed Gein was quiet, awkward, even kind in the eyes of those who knew him. The evil came from the emptiness within him, from the echo of a mother's voice that never stopped whispering in his mind. In 1998, a documentary crew returned to Plainfield to film a retrospective. By then, the farm's location had become overgrown with weeds and trees. Only a few rusted nails and bits of foundation remained. As the camera rolled, the wind moved through the fields, and the sound was eerily like breathing. One of the crew members said later, "It felt like the ground itself remembered." The older residents refused to talk on camera. Some still feared the Gein name, others just wanted peace. But younger locals treated it as folklore, a story their grandparents told to keep kids from wandering into the woods. They laughed nervously, repeating the same urban legends, that you could still hear footsteps on foggy nights, or that strange lights sometimes flickered where the farmhouse once stood. Yet beneath those tales there's a truth that never fades. Ed Gein changed American horror forever. Before him, the monsters in stories were imaginary, creatures from myths and ghost tales. After him, the monster had a face, a farm, and a name. He made horror real. His legacy became a mirror. Each movie, each retelling forced people to look at what they feared most, that beneath the surface of normal life, darkness can grow quietly, unnoticed until it's too late. Plainfield was just an ordinary town. Ed was just an ordinary man. But somewhere between those two truths, something went terribly wrong. Today, his story still draws millions of views online. Documentaries on Netflix and YouTube rack up comments like "unbelievable," and "I can't imagine this was real." New generations rediscover his crimes as if they were fresh, shocked that something so horrifying could happen in the middle of small-town America. Every Halloween, his name trends again. But to the people of Plainfield, it's not a story. It's a scar that never healed. Some graves he disturbed are still visited by families who whisper prayers over the dirt, hoping to reclaim the dignity their loved ones lost. For them, Ed Gein isn't a legend. He's a wound in their history. As one local minister said years later, the devil doesn't always come with horns. Sometimes he wears a farmer's cap and says good morning.